Guys, I'm gonna be honest with you.
I have crippling depression.
And lately, your boy hasn't been doing so good. The days are long and nights are longer, and there isn't much that brings me happiness these days.
They ask you how you are, and you just have to say that you're fine.
Well, except for...
pizza time.
Yeah, the shit's about to kick off. This party looks wet. Let's take it back to straight hip-hop and start it from scratch. About to bloody this back up. Everybody get back.
I fucking love the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. It's one of the few things I can watch that instantly puts me in a good mood. It could be nostalgia, since these did come out when I was in elementary and middle school, or it could be the fact that these movies have a certain charm to them that I haven't seen in any other movie, and it's hard for me to put my finger on it, but whenever I watch these movies, they instantly put a smile on my face. I guess it could be the very lighthearted, upbeat, and sometimes cheesy feel to them. At times, they can feel really goofy with the hilarious lines of dialogue, the amount of random extras that pop on screen to say a random line, also some weird editing choices. It has some strange stuff in it, but this is all by design, and it pulls it off very well and with such style that you can't help but to be entertained by it. But on the flip side, these movies also do a great job of conveying other emotions and really make you feel for the characters on screen. So when it's having fun, you're having fun. When the characters are going through turmoil, you feel for them. And it's really impressive how they managed to do that. Now, even though I love these movies, yes, even the third one, I can admit that they aren't perfect and they have some flaws. So we're going to take a trip down memory lane. I'm going to give you my thoughts on each movie in the trilogy. This won't be structured like my normal reviews. Really, I'm just going to talk briefly about what I liked and didn't like, giving you my general thoughts on each movie, so they won't be as in-depth as they normally are. Also, I'm going to assume you've already seen these movies, so spoilers ahead. So out of all three of the Raimi movies, the first one aged quote-unquote the worst. And I'm not saying that in the same way I've seen others say it, like, oh no, Peter makes a gay joke, therefore this movie is now terrible.
That's a cute outfit. Did your husband give it to you?
What are you, fucking gay?
What I mean is more so about the special effects and CGI, and some strange editing choices that kind of feel cliche and cheap. Like when Peter's DNA is changing after he gets bit by the spider. The editing just looks very cheap in this scene. And then there's that random transition with Green Goblin just yelling at the camera. It's kind of hilarious. It feels very much like it was made in the early 2000s, because you know, it was. But besides the obvious stuff that I know wasn't going to hold up nearly 20 years later, just about everything else in this movie is great. From the story to the music to the characters, it all holds up pretty well. The story is well paced and there's never a dull moment. The way it structures makes sure there's always something happening and you're always engaged. Like you'll get Spider-Man's origin, then Green Goblin's origin. Peter will do something, then Norman will do something. Spider-Man does some stuff, Green Goblin does some stuff. The movie bounces back and forth to keep you up to speed on what's happening. I thought it really flew by and no time felt wasted. And the characters are all pretty great too. The movie clearly tells you what you need to know about them, so you get a sense of who they are. Sure, Green Goblin feels kind of like a pretty simple, one-note, goofy villain, but that's why he works so well here. The whole movie has a cheesy feel to it, so a simple one-note villain really fits right in. I mean, when you really break it down, most of the characters here are pretty simple. You got Mary Jane, the love interest, the girl next door. Harry, the best friend who just wants affection from his father. Peter, the nerdy, awkward teen who fights crime as a superhero because he feels it's his responsibility to do so because he has the power to do it. I mean, it's not a bad thing. The movie clearly tells you who these characters are so that they're easy to understand and get behind. Now, I've seen people complain about the cheesy feel and say that they can't take it seriously because of it, but what I think this movie does well is that it counterbalances the goofier moments with serious emotional ones because of how well it establishes the characters. It makes most of them pretty likable so you care about what happens to them. So yes, this movie is very cheesy, but it knows how to hit the emotional heartstrings. The only character that I would consider weak is Mary Jane. She's the love interest and her and Peter don't have much chemistry, at least not in this movie. But every other character was good, and J. Jonah Jameson is the best. J.K. Simmons owns this role, and when he's on screen, he just demands your attention. I love him, he's the best character. And the second best character, I think, is Peter. Tobey Maguire pulls off the shy, awkward teen really well, and as Spider-Man, I think he's fine. He is more confident when he's in the suit, which is good. He's not throwing out a bunch of one-liners, but he's clearly more confident, and he does act differently. Now, one of the only downsides I can think of is the fight choreography. It's not the best, like this one in the rain. Although I do like the final fight with the Green Goblin at the warehouse. It was a gritty, dirty street fight, and they fuck each other up. And like I already mentioned, MJ and Peter's chemistry isn't the best, and of course the effects and CGI didn't age that well, but it's 20 years old, I'm not gonna hold that against it. I mean, other than those really small things, I still really enjoyed it. I think it's one of the best superhero origin movies, and does a very good job at setting up the characters and the world. It's very fun and cheesy at times, but it can also be emotional and it needs to be. It's still a solid movie, and I enjoy it to this day. And there really isn't much more I can say, I like it. Although I will say this, fans were not ready for what was about to come next.
Shit! Did you just come in your sister?
I and she asked me to come.
Now, I don't think it's crazy to say that Spider-Man 2 is the definition of a perfect sequel. It does everything a sequel is supposed to do. It builds on top of what was already established in the previous entry, it fixes things that didn't work so well, and expands on the things that did. It moves the characters forward in a way that makes sense, and it goes bigger. Making a sequel is always risky because sometimes the people behind the movie might not be able to capture what made the previous so good. Or maybe it tries to go bigger but doesn't stick the landing. Spider-Man 2, on the other hand, doesn't fall victim to this, and it really is the gold standard for what a sequel should be. I think Tobey Maguire put it best.
He didn't just like, oh, make a better film. Oh, this is better than the first one. I mean, he whooped the first one's ass.
Now, I'm not gonna lie, for the longest time, I always thought this movie was overrated, and I actually preferred the first one. But really thinking about it, I mostly felt that way because I was more so annoyed of hearing of how great this movie is, so I kinda subconsciously just started disliking it, and I felt that way for years. But after sitting down and watching them all, I'm happy to say that I was wrong, and this movie is great. I might even say, amazing. I'm really blown away about how well made it is, and how well it holds up. Sure, some of the effects are a little spotty, but overall the movie looks good. I have just 2 little complaints, but it's really not enough to ruin the movie for me. I'll go over what those are towards the end of this section. But for now, let me tell you what this movie improves on that I thought wasn't so good from the first. My main gripe with Spider-Man 1 was the fight and action scenes. I felt the fight choreography wasn't that impressive and kinda stale. Spider-Man 2 rectifies that and has some of the best Spider-Man action. The fighting is slick and creative as hell. The way Spider-Man swings around and uses his webs is amazing, and it's still crazy watching this stuff and realizing this was 2004, and it's still great even by today's standards. So the fights are greatly improved upon. My second biggest complaint from the first was MJ and Peter's relationship. I didn't feel the chemistry. Here I'm happy to say that it's much better, and they interact much more, although it's still not the best, but at least it's more believable. So I'll allow it. Now, what I really like is the story and the direction it took the characters. The first one actually ended on a downer for Peter and his friends. They're all at Norman's funeral, and Peter rejects MJ's advances to become a couple, because he knows he can't be Spider-Man and be with her, because of the dangers that could happen to her. In Spider-Man 2, that's actually expanded upon to show how having superpowers and being a hero can put a damper on your personal life, and how hard it is to balance it all. Also at the end of Spider-Man 1, Harry is mourning his father's death, and swears to make Spider-Man pay. In Spider-Man 2, he slowly lets his need for revenge consume him, to the point that it affects his relationship with Peter. And then there's Mary Jane. She tries to move on and even gets engaged, but she can't get over Peter even though it's been 2 years. It was really interesting seeing where these characters went, but more importantly, it was a pretty believable direction for them to go, and it makes sense for their characters. I personally think Peter's dilemma of whether or not to be Spider-Man and Harry's growing need for revenge are the best parts of the movie. That's the stuff I enjoy seeing the most. The relationship stuff was fine, and the movie balances all these things well, but I personally like seeing Peter's struggle and Harry's rage more. Otto Octavius is a great villain. The movie really makes you feel sorry for him. The guy lost his wife and is being manipulated by the AI robotic arms into doing bad stuff to complete his work, which I always thought was weird, but when you think about it, the arms were designed for that experiment, so it makes sense that the arms would want to complete it. I love seeing his journey from being a confident, happy scientist to a broken man after he loses his wife and the experiment fails, to then becoming a cocky villain who will stop at nothing to complete his work. But then he snaps back to his normal self and finally realizes what he's been doing. He then makes the ultimate sacrifice to save the city. It's a great character arc, and honestly, he's still one of the best Spider-Man villains we've gotten. Low-key can't wait to see him in No Way Home.
Hello, Peter. I'm gonna come.
Now, this movie is less cheesy and goofy than the first. Don't get me wrong, it still has its moments, but it pulls back the cheese a little bit and gives us a story that can be taken more seriously. And because of this, I think the emotional scenes hit harder. Although there are a few lines that make me chuckle because of the hilarious delivery.
Punch me, I bleed.
And this isn't to say that the movie isn't funny, it's still very hilarious, it just does a good job at balancing the humor with the more serious moments. I found myself getting more invested into the characters and story because it did feel more serious. It felt like there was more weight to it. Oh yeah, and the score by Danny Elfman is top notch. Nothing more I can really say, I really like it. So, the action is top notch, the characters are great, the effects look good, and the editing and cinematography are very creative. Everything is improved upon in every possible way. So what could my complaints be? Well, I know I'm gonna get shit for this, but here's the first one. I think it's dumb that Peter is losing his powers. And I get that's probably how the story goes in the comics, but I feel like you could still do the movie but not have him lose his powers. To me, it just doesn't make any sense. That shit's in his DNA, and it doesn't really make sense that it just starts going away because he doesn't believe in himself, or know who he is, or who he wants to be. I also get that him losing his powers is a metaphorical thing, but I just think it's dumb. And really all they had to do is just have him not use his powers. Like, he sees a situation that his powers would help him resolve, but instead of getting involved, he just walks away and focuses on himself. I feel like by doing that, it could have had the same effect. I just know I'm gonna get shit for not liking that aspect of the movie, but hey, I'm ready for it. Another small detail I always thought was strange was that Doc Ock might have robotic arms, but he's still human. He wasn't given a serum that makes him super strong. So I always found it weird that he could literally take blows from Spider-Man. He doesn't have super strength, he's just a dude. I always thought that was weird, and that's literally the only complaints I have. These things don't ruin the movie for me, and I can easily look past them. I mean, hell, there are several things I can nitpick in all these movies that I could let bother me, but I don't, because the good stuff is so good that I don't really care about the little things. So Spider-Man 2 was a hell of a sequel, and it really raised our expectations for the follow-up, because this movie sets itself up for a sequel perfectly. Now, were those expectations met in the third film? Well...
Peter, what is it?
It's MJ. I'm gonna ask her to me.
Before I talk about the movie, I want to briefly mention that there were a lot of behind-the-scenes shenanigans and disagreements between Raimi and Sony, and there's a lot of shit to unpack there, but the long and short of it is this. Raimi wanted to do Sandman and continue the story of Harry's revenge, as the new Green Goblin, while Sony and the producers wanted to do Venom. So to compromise, they had all three in this movie. There's a lot more behind-the-scenes drama there, but I don't really want to dive deep into it. I just wanted to mention to let you guys know that there was a lot of back and forth between Raimi, the studio, and the producers on the direction of the movie. So we're gonna go ahead and just take a look at the version of the movie that we actually got. It's hard to describe the hype for this movie back in 2007. Coming off Spider-Man 2, people were really looking forward to it. It's also possibly one of the most disappointing movies I can remember seeing. There's quite a bit wrong with it, but I want to talk about the good things and stuff that I enjoyed before I got into the problems. Alright, so all the fight scenes are pretty awesome. I'd say most of them are just as good as the second, and I do like the tag team battle at the end. So the fight and action scenes are pretty good. J. Jonah Jameson is still the best character and still hilarious. The score by Danny Elfman is great as usual, the black suit looks good as hell, and this is one of my favorite shots in the whole movie. It's just beautiful. Speaking of beautiful shots, Sandman's first scene is really great too. And I actually don't mind Eddie Brock here. Here he's basically supposed to be the opposite of Peter. While Peter is a kind, caring, honest man, Brock is sleazy and selfish and willing to lie and cheat to get his way. They're two sides of the same coin. But if you don't like him, I don't blame you.
You're trash, Brock.
And that's about it really. There are pieces of brilliance in this movie. When watching, I can find myself enjoying several little things, but overall the big picture isn't that great, which leads me to the stuff that isn't that good. This is an overstuffed movie. It tries to continue the story of Harry Osborn, introduce the Sandman, tell the story of the symbiote, and Venom. It's a lot to cram into a 2-hour runtime, and it works about as well as you think it does. So the way they try balancing this is by shifting focus on each villain and part of the symbiote story. It goes like this. It starts off with the symbiote landing on Earth. Then you get one fight with Harry before he's sidelined with amnesia. Then Sandman is the focus along with the symbiote giving Peter the black suit. Then Sandman is taken out and Harry gets his memory back. Then Peter takes out Harry again. Peter becomes a dick for a while. Then Sandman comes back. Peter gets rid of the symbiote. Then Eddie turns into Venom. Then he teams up with Sandman for the final battle. And not to mention, between all that, you have Peter and Mary Jane's relationship issues. So the issue is, none of these villains or plot points really feel like a presence on screen and kind of gets forgotten about until the movie brings them back up again later. It keeps shifting focus, and because of this, nothing really seems fleshed out. Like Sandman is a perfect example of this. They tried to go the tragic villain route like they did in Spider-Man 2, but the issue is, there'll be large chunks of the movie where he's just not in it. So I'm not really invested in a character that I barely even see. Speaking of which, it sucks that Venom is barely even in this movie. In the last 30 minutes, Eddie becomes Venom, teams up with Sandman, kidnaps Mary Jane, then Harry decides to help Peter, then the big final battle happens. Then boom, it's over. It all feels so rushed. The movie tries to cover a lot of stuff, but clearly doesn't balance it all that well. I really don't like what they did with Mary Jane. They made her so unlikable, and she's basically jealous of the attention that Peter is getting as Spider-Man. It just feels so out of left field and petty. I think this is the movie that made people not really like her at all, because in the first two, I thought she was fine. But here, the way she treats Peter, and in return, the way Peter treats her, is just so annoying. Honestly, the relationship drama in this movie just isn't that good in general, because you got Mary Jane being petty as hell, and you have Peter just being dumb as hell, and they don't talk out their issues in this movie, which makes it really frustrating when they're arguing. Yes, I really did not like the relationship stuff in this one. Now my last biggest complaint is that I think it's completely unnecessary that this movie tries to tie itself back to the first one by having Flint Marko be involved in Uncle Ben's death. It feels like a weak excuse to make things personal between him and Peter. For me personally, I thought it was kinda dumb.
That was so poorly handled.
So I guess to conclude, this movie is basically a mixture of decisions that don't make much sense, with some bright spots sprinkled throughout. I still find entertainment in it because I think this teeters on it's so bad it's good. There are still some funny moments here, and there is a layer of cheese to things, but everything is handled so poorly that even the funny, cheesy charm can't save it. I think my actual hatred for this movie vanished back in high school, and all that's left is just accepting the movie for what it is, and laughing at the things that it does wrong. I know that sounds mean, but realistically, that's actually the best case scenario. It's hard to describe how disappointing this movie was when it first came out. So at this point, all I can do is just accept a mixture of poor decisions, good music, dumb characters, and fun action. Because that's really what we're left with. But hey, at least this movie brought us Bully Maguire.
I fucked your bitch, you fat motherfucker.
So there you have it, those are my thoughts on the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. I think these are some very entertaining films. They have their own charm to them, and most of all, they're fun. But of course, nostalgia does play a huge factor when looking back at these movies for me, because I grew up with them. This is how I was introduced to Spider-Man. Hell, it's actually how a lot of people were introduced to the character. So these movies hold a special place in a lot of people's hearts. They're goofy, they're fun, they're lighthearted, action-packed, and very entertaining. And of course, as always, I asked you guys, what did you think of the trilogy? And it was no surprise seeing that majority of the people loved it. Some even claiming that it's the best superhero trilogy of all time. And for the hell of it, I decided to do a poll, asking out of the trilogy which one was the best. And no surprise, Spider-Man 2 won by a landslide. I'm actually really surprised how close Spider-Man 1 and 3 are. And now this is the part where I asked you guys, go ahead and leave a comment and let me know what do you think about the Spider-Man trilogy, and which one was your favorite. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, go and drop a like on it. Thanks for watching, I'll catch you next time.
Hey, wow, Dr. Connors. Sorry,
Where were you headed, Parker?
to your class.
My class is exhausted.
I'm sorry.